This story is not about fate, nor about a cruel world that denied a man his chance. It is about a man who had chances and ignored them. It is about someone who mistook comfort for intelligence, dependence for security, and laziness for peace. He was not born into poverty. He did not begin at the bottom. In fact, he began with stability, with support, with time on his side. But time, when wasted long enough, becomes the most unforgiving enemy. This is the story of how a man who refused to work slowly watched his life collapse, not because life was unfair, but because he believed effort was optional and consequences were distant. He grew up in a modest but stable home where his parents worked tirelessly to provide what they never had. Food was always on the table. Bills were paid before they became threats. His clothes were clean. His room was warm. While other young men worried about survival, he worried about nothing at all. That absence of pressure shaped him more than hardship ever could. As he grew older, responsibility approached him quietly, as it approaches all young adults, but he refused to acknowledge it. When school ended, he did not feel urgency. He felt relief. Relief that he no longer had to wake up early. Relief that he could finally rest without guilt. While his friends rushed toward universities, apprenticeships, and entry-level jobs, complaining about schedules and supervisors, he watched them with quiet amusement, convincing himself they were surrendering their freedom while he was preserving his. He told himself he was smarter than they were, that he would wait for something better, something comfortable, something worthy of his potential. Waiting became his profession. At first his parents were patient. They assumed he simply needed time to decide what he wanted. They encouraged him gently, offering suggestions, mentioning job openings, introducing him to acquaintances who could help. He nodded, promised, delayed. Each day followed the same predictable rhythm. Waking late, scrolling endlessly through his phone, consuming entertainment, criticizing society, speaking confidently about success without ever taking a step toward it. He became skilled at discussing ambition while avoiding action. He rejected small job offers because they were beneath him. He claimed the salaries were too low, the hours too long, the managers too strict. In truth, he feared discomfort. He feared effort. He feared routine. Comfort wrapped around him like a soft blanket, and he refused to step outside it. Years began to pass almost invisibly. His friends progressed, slowly building experience, enduring setbacks, learning resilience. Some struggled financially at first, but they were moving forward. He remained exactly where he had started. Family gatherings became uncomfortable. Relatives began asking questions about his plans, his career, his future. He responded with vague answers about projects and opportunities, masking emptiness with confidence. His parents' smiles grew thinner each year. They were aging. Work exhausted them more quickly. Medical appointments became more frequent. Expenses increased. They asked him, politely at first, to contribute something small, help with groceries, cover a utility bill, ease the burden slightly. Instead of feeling responsibility, he felt insulted. In his mind, support was still their duty. He promised he would find work soon, but soon had no deadline. He submitted a few careless applications, barely reading the descriptions, barely preparing for interviews. Rejections arrived, and instead of motivating him, they strengthened his excuses. He blamed the economy, corruption, favoritism, anything except his own lack of discipline. He told himself that the right opportunity would eventually appear, and when it did, he would rise effortlessly. But opportunity rarely visits those who never prepare for it. The first real crack in his comfortable life appeared gradually. His parents stopped paying for his luxuries. They insisted he cover his phone bill. They limited the extra money they once handed him casually. The shift felt like betrayal to him. He argued that without a job, he could not contribute, and when they replied calmly, "Then get one," he felt cornered rather than awakened. Instead of responding with action, he responded with resentment. Tension filled the house. Silence replaced casual conversations. He began spending more time isolated in his room, avoiding eye contact, avoiding accountability. Yet even then, he believed this discomfort was temporary. He assumed his parents would eventually give in, that they would always protect him from consequences. He underestimated how exhaustion changes people. He underestimated how long patience can last. One evening, he overheard his parents speaking in low, worried voices about finances and the future. They were discussing retirement, medical costs, and what would happen if they could no longer work. For a brief moment, fear pierced through his denial. What if they truly could not support him forever? The thought unsettled him deeply, but instead of using that fear as fuel, he suppressed it. He convinced himself that things would somehow work out, that circumstances would adjust around him, that life would not force him into responsibility. That quiet refusal to change, that stubborn belief that effort was optional, marked the beginning of his slow descent. He did not realize it then, but the foundation beneath his life was weakening, and he had built nothing of his own to stand on when it finally collapsed. He did not understand that decline rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. It begins quietly, with small withdrawals of comfort, with subtle changes in tone, with doors that no longer open as easily as they once did. The house that had always felt like a permanent shelter slowly began to feel temporary. His parents no longer spoke to him about plans in a hopeful voice. Instead, their conversations carried a quiet finality. His father, whose shoulders had once seemed strong and unbreakable, now moved more slowly, wincing when he thought no one was looking. His mother, once endlessly patient, now carried a fatigue that could not be hidden behind gentle smiles. The air in the house had changed. It was no longer a place of unlimited tolerance. It was a place of counting expenses, of difficult calculations, of whispered concerns late at night. One morning, his father sat him down at the small kitchen table where so many comfortable meals had been shared over the years. There was no anger in his father's eyes, only exhaustion, and something else, disappointment wrapped in sadness. He explained calmly that he would be retiring soon, not because he wanted to, but because his body could not continue at the same pace. Income would shrink. Savings were not infinite. The household could no longer carry an adult son who contributed nothing. The words were not shouted. They were not cruel. They were simply honest. For the first time, the comfort he had relied on felt fragile. His father did not demand immediate miracles, but he made it clear. Within a few months, he would need to take responsibility for himself. Instead of responding with urgency, he responded with defensive pride. He left the table irritated, telling himself they were exaggerating, that retirement did not mean disaster, that something would come up. Yet, beneath the layers of denial, a quiet anxiety began to grow. He applied to a few jobs with slightly more seriousness this time, but years of inactivity had left him unprepared. His resume was thin. Interviews felt intimidating. Employers asked about experience he did not have, skills he had never bothered to develop, discipline he had never practiced. Each rejection felt heavier than the last. The world, which he had once criticized so confidently from the safety of his bedroom, now seemed indifferent and closed. As the months passed, the financial shift became visible. Groceries became simpler. Luxuries disappeared entirely. His parents sold small items they no longer needed. The car was used less often to save fuel. The house felt quieter, heavier. He noticed these changes, yet instead of feeling motivated, he felt trapped. He had spent years building a life centered around comfort, and now comfort was evaporating. When his father finally retired, the monthly income dropped sharply. The reality he had postponed for so long now stood directly in front of him, unmovable. Then came the moment he had subconsciously feared. His father told him that within 2 months he would need to find somewhere else to live if he could not contribute financially. The words were not spoken with cruelty. They were spoken with necessity. His parents had reached the limit of what they could sacrifice. For the first time in his life, he felt something close to panic. The walls of his room, once symbols of security, now felt like a countdown. Nights became restless. Sleep escaped him. Thoughts of rent, food, bills, concepts he had ignored for years, now circled his mind relentlessly. He searched desperately for work, lowering his standards rapidly. Jobs he had once mocked now seemed valuable. But employers sensed his lack of consistency. Years of idleness cannot be hidden easily. His answers in interviews lacked confidence because they lacked truth. When asked what he had been doing for the past several years, his explanation sounded hollow, even to himself. Opportunities slipped through his fingers. Time moved faster than ever before. Eventually, the deadline arrived. With no stable income and no solid plan, he packed his belongings into a few worn suitcases. The departure was quiet. His mother hugged him longer than usual. His father avoided prolonged eye contact, not out of anger, but because seeing his son leave under these circumstances hurt more than words could express. He stepped outside the house not as an ambitious young man ready to conquer the world, but as someone forced into it without preparation. The door closed behind him, and with it closed the chapter of effortless living. At first he stayed with a distant friend, promising it would be temporary. But temporary has weight when you have no direction. Days turned into weeks. His friend began to show subtle irritation. Shared spaces grew tense. He tried finding small daily labor jobs, moving furniture, cleaning storage spaces, assisting in warehouses, but his body, unaccustomed to physical strain, tired quickly. His pride suffered even more. The money he earned was inconsistent and barely enough for basic expenses. For the first time, he felt the direct relationship between effort and survival. No one handed him comfort anymore. Every meal required calculation. Every bus ride required budgeting. Slowly, friends stopped inviting him out. Conversations became awkward. They had progressed, careers, families, responsibilities, while he was fighting to cover next week's rent in a shared room. The contrast was painful. He began to understand something he had ignored for years. Time does not pause for indecision. While he had been waiting for the perfect opportunity, life had been moving forward without him. Eventually, even the temporary shelter with his friend ended. Unable to maintain consistent payments, he found himself renting the cheapest room he could afford in a neglected part of the city. The building was old. The walls were thin. The neighborhood was loud and unforgiving. The mattress was uncomfortable. The room was small and cold at night. There were moments when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying years of wasted time in his mind. Regret arrived not as a dramatic emotion, but as a heavy silence pressing against his chest. He finally understood that poverty is rarely sudden. It is often the accumulated result of postponed decisions, ignored warnings, and comfortable excuses repeated for too long. Each year of laziness had quietly removed one layer of security. Now there were no layers left. He was alone with consequences. And yet, the harshest realization was not the financial struggle. It was the awareness that he had once stood at the edge of potential and deliberately chosen stagnation. The world had not stolen his success. He had traded it for comfort. The descent was not finished yet. It was only entering its most unforgiving stage. The small rented room began to feel less like temporary hardship and more like a permanent reflection of who he had become. The ceiling had faint stains from old leaks, the window barely closed properly, and the sounds of arguments, traffic, and distant sirens drifted through the thin walls at all hours of the night. At first he told himself this was just a phase, that he would recover quickly, that this discomfort would motivate him into transformation. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the dramatic turning point he imagined never arrived. Instead, reality worked on him slowly, grinding away at his pride, exposing the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. He found irregular work wherever he could, unloading delivery trucks before sunrise, cleaning construction debris after long days of noise and dust, assisting in cramped storage facilities where the air felt heavy and stale. The work was physically exhausting, and his body protested constantly. Muscles he had never developed ached intensely. His hands, once soft from years of idleness, became rough and marked with small cuts. Each task felt like a reminder of how unprepared he was for adult life. Yet even in these moments, he sometimes caught himself resenting the effort rather than accepting responsibility. A part of him still whispered that he deserved something easier, something more comfortable, something aligned with the image he once had of himself. That internal conflict exhausted him more than the labor itself. Money slipped through his fingers as quickly as he earned it. Rent consumed most of it. Food prices forced him into strict choices. Some nights, he ate little more than cheap bread and instant noodles, telling himself he was not truly hungry. The simple act of budgeting became a daily source of anxiety. He began to understand the mathematics of survival, how small expenses accumulate, how emergencies arrive without warning, how one missed payment can destabilize everything. The luxury of ignoring numbers had vanished. Now every coin carried weight. Social isolation deepened. He avoided contacting old friends because he did not want to answer questions about his situation. Their online photos, promotions, weddings, new apartments felt like evidence of a race he had refused to run and now could not rejoin easily. Conversations with his parents became shorter. They offered encouragement, but beneath their voices he sensed worry. He no longer blamed them. For the first time, he recognized that they had tried, repeatedly, to warn him. He had mistaken their patience for obligation. There were nights when regret kept him awake longer than noise ever could. He replayed specific moments from the past, job opportunities he dismissed, advice he mocked, mornings he chose to sleep instead of prepare for something meaningful. Memory became a courtroom where he was both defendant and judge. No one had forced him into laziness. No one had prevented him from trying. The truth was painfully simple. He had chosen comfort repeatedly until comfort disappeared. Winter arrived, harsh and unforgiving. The old building's heating system functioned poorly, and cold air crept through cracks around the window frame. He layered his clothes indoors, sleeping under thin blankets that barely held warmth. Work became harder in freezing temperatures, especially when assignments required standing outside before dawn. He watched other workers move efficiently, with quiet discipline, and realized that many of them had faced hardships far greater than his. Yet they had developed resilience instead of excuses. That realization struck him deeply. For years he had believed he avoided work because he was too smart for ordinary jobs. Now he understood that intelligence without discipline collapses under pressure. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day carrying heavy materials at a construction site, he sat alone on the narrow edge of his bed and allowed himself to think clearly without denial. He recognized a pattern. Every stage of his decline had followed the same logic. First came avoidance, then justification, then consequence. He avoided responsibility, justified his avoidance with pride, and eventually faced the outcome. The poverty surrounding him was not random misfortune. It was accumulated avoidance. That thought did not immediately solve his problems, but it stripped away the last layer of illusion. For the first time, he stopped searching for quick rescue. He stopped imagining sudden success or miraculous opportunities. Instead, he considered something unfamiliar to him: slow, consistent effort without immediate reward. The idea felt uncomfortable, almost humiliating, because it required accepting how far behind he had fallen. Yet it also carried a strange sense of relief. If his current state was the result of repeated small failures to act, perhaps improvement could be the result of repeated small decisions to act differently. He began waking earlier than necessary, even on days without scheduled work. At first, it felt pointless. There was no applause, no visible transformation. But he used the extra hours to search seriously for stable employment, to learn basic skills online through free resources, to rebuild a resume that had once embarrassed him. Progress was slow, painfully slow, but it was real. He secured a steady position at a warehouse, not glamorous, not comfortable, but stable. The routine was demanding, yet predictability replaced chaos. He forced himself to show up on time every day, even when exhaustion tempted him back toward old habits. The change was not dramatic enough to erase his poverty immediately. His room remained small. His meals remained simple. His savings were minimal. But internally, something shifted. For the first time, effort preceded expectation. He no longer believed success was owed to him. He began to understand it must be built. The regret did not disappear, but it transformed into quiet motivation rather than paralyzing shame. He had fallen far, farther than he ever imagined possible when he once lay comfortably in his parents' house, dismissing the world's demands. Poverty had stripped him of illusions, pride, and dependency. What remained was a man finally aware of his own responsibility. Whether that awareness would lead him to stability or merely prevent further collapse was still uncertain. But one truth stood undeniable. Laziness had cost him years, comfort, and dignity. The price had been heavy. And now, standing in that cold room with rough hands and tired muscles, he understood something he had once refused to accept. Time does not wait for anyone who wastes it. It moves forward regardless, rewarding discipline and punishing delay. He had reached a stage where survival itself became a teacher far harsher than anything he had known in comfort. Every decision carried weight. Every delayed action threatened him. And yet he knew that true change was still possible, but only if he confronted the consequences of years of inaction head on. Each morning he woke earlier, not because it was easy or enjoyable, but because he had no other choice. The routines that had once bored him now became lifelines. Showering, dressing, commuting, clocking in, performing repetitive labor. All of it grounded him in reality and reminded him, constantly, that life does not reward idleness. The work was grueling, both physically and mentally. He labored alongside men and women who had faced far worse hardships, and yet moved forward with resilience he had never possessed. He observed them quietly, learning discipline without being told. They had scars on their hands and faces, fatigue in their voices, yet they smiled, laughed, and spoke with a sense of pride that came from knowing they were building something, however modest, with their own effort. Comparison, which once served as a tool for his arrogance, now humbled him. He understood that intelligence, charm, or ideas are meaningless without action, and that pride without discipline is fragile and fleeting. At home he faced loneliness that pierced deeper than physical cold or hunger ever had. He thought about old friends who had advanced in life while he scrambled to pay rent. He thought about the opportunities he had dismissed, the advice he had ignored, the work he had refused to undertake. The memories of his past laziness were not just regrets. They were lessons etched in pain, reminders that time cannot be borrowed indefinitely. When he lay awake at night, the weight of what he had thrown away pressed upon him in a tangible way. Each choice he had postponed returned to him like a relentless echo. Yet in the midst of hardship, small victories emerged. He learned to manage his budget, stretch a meal, and save a small portion of his income each week. He took pride in punctuality, in the small skills he gained on the job, in the reliability he could now offer. The process was slow and often discouraging, but for the first time in years, he was building something of his own. Stability, he realized, is earned, not given. Comfort, when unearned, is fleeting. The very lessons he had resisted now became the foundation for rebuilding his life. His health suffered, yet strengthened, in strange ways. The aches in his back and hands, the sore muscles and stiff joints, reminded him of effort, endurance, and persistence. He came to understand the body and mind are intimately connected to discipline. Physical hardship no longer scared him because he knew that it was temporary, whereas the consequences of repeated inaction had been permanent and devastating. He tried to reconnect with his parents, not to reclaim comfort, but to acknowledge the support they had given him and the patience they had shown despite his failures. Their eyes, still full of love, reflected both relief and lingering disappointment. He apologized, not for mistakes in theory, but for years of wasted time, opportunities, and privileges. The weight lifted slightly, though the scars of neglecting his own responsibilities remained. As months passed, his life slowly stabilized, not dramatically, not as a miracle, but as a result of consistent effort, honesty, and humility. He saved a little, avoided unnecessary spending, and gained the respect of colleagues and neighbors who had witnessed his transformation. Regret remained, but now it served as a guide rather than a prison. He no longer fantasized about shortcuts, schemes, or luck. He recognized that only deliberate, sustained action would allow him to regain dignity and security. Ultimately, he realized the bitter truth that laziness had stolen more than money. It had stolen years, opportunities, relationships, and confidence. Poverty had forced him to confront reality in a way comfort never could. And yet, the harshest lesson carried the most profound truth. Recovery is possible, but only through personal responsibility, relentless effort, and the refusal to return to old habits. Time had punished him, but it had also taught him that no one can build a life for you. Only you can do it, step by step, choice by choice, day after day. As he stood in his small, cold room one evening, exhausted yet awake with clarity, he understood that the life he had squandered could never be fully reclaimed. Yet what remained was infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that he could shape the life ahead, that every hour and every effort now counted, and that nothing, not comfort, not excuses, not fear, could take that away from him again. He had fallen deeply, painfully, almost irreversibly, but he had learned the truth. Laziness destroys quietly, opportunity waits briefly, and responsibility is the only path to survival, dignity, and eventually, respect for oneself.